Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our Kawakib webinars. Our guest speaker today, Dr. Vardy Dravitsky, is full professor at the Bioethics Program School of Public Health at the University of Montreal and part-time senior lecturer on global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. She is president of the International Association of Bioethics and director of ethics and health at the Center for Research on Ethics. Dr. Vardy is a 2020 Trudeau Foundation Fellow and Chair of the Foundation's COVID-19 Impact Committee, as well as Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and of the Hastings Centre. She is member of the Standing Committee on Ethics of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and of its Institute of Genetics Advisory Board. She is also a member of the National Human Genome Research Institute's Genomics and Society Working Group, and her research focuses on the ethics of genomics and reproduction and is funded by Canada's leading funding agencies. She published over 170 articles and commentaries on bioethical issues. That is without mentioning the number of lectures, talks, and webinars that she has been doing. Vardy and I met when I was honored to join the International Association of Bioethics as board member. And in all honesty, I really consider myself lucky knowing such a frivolous and feisty thinker, a superb human being whose determination and resilience inspired all of us at the IAB, and an intellectual with insatiable thirst for discovery and sharing. Her smile and optimism during the hardest times of the COVID-19 pandemic will never leave our hearts and minds. Welcome, Vardy, and thank you for giving us some time to give this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Talia, for this warm and lovely introduction. I feel exactly the same, that I'm honored and fortunate to be working with you and to know you. And I really hope that we can all meet in person soon and celebrate the end of this pandemic. However, in the meanwhile, we're obviously all focused right now on the vaccines, because that is our endpoint, that is our way out. Every country is in a different situation right now, so global conversations are particularly interesting. I'm speaking to you right now from Ontario, Canada. We are still in complete shutdown. No schools, no stores. We're not allowed to leave the house. In other provinces of Canada, there are schools, but there's a curfew. You can't leave your house after 9 p.m. South of the border in the US, anyone can get a vaccine, but people don't want it. So the issues are really different depending on your location. And I'm really looking forward to hear from you about the situation in Lebanon and what your current challenges are. I wanted to give some introductory remarks about the ethics, maybe a little bit the politics of vaccine rollout currently. And I think the first way to frame the issues is to go from the global to the local. On the global level, we're obviously dealing with the issue of equity. There are huge gaps between countries right now. So as I said, in the US, there's more than enough. And in places like India, we're seeing what the lack of vaccine is doing to the current wave, where people are literally dying, unable to even get medical care in a hospital. So when we see the way the world is kind of coping right now with issues of supply and demand and distribution, so many ethical issues come into play. President Biden from the US just announced very recently that the US will supply vaccines to other countries, which is a great move. But what about a more systemic solution? What about the patent, the intellectual property around the knowledge to produce vaccines locally? What about production capacity? What about global bodies that are supposed to distribute vaccines equitably based on ethical guidelines? These are all huge issues that we will not resolve today, but there's fascinating bioethics writing on these issues published weekly now that I encourage everybody to read, to share. Happy to send some papers after this talk. I want to focus on one issue related to global equity, and that is the famous idea of vaccine passports. That is the notion that pretty soon, in some places already, in order to travel outside of your country, you'll have to show proof of vaccination. Otherwise, you will not be able to board a flight, cross a border, enter another country. There are many issues related to privacy protection because you're sharing your medical information with a foreign government. Of all the ethical issues that touch on vaccine passports, I want to go back to that global equity issue. Some people tell us that in low and middle income countries, in some low middle income countries, vaccines will be available to enough people to reach herd immunity maybe in 2, 3, or 4 years. If more countries begin to demand vaccine passports to allow you to enter, what is going to happen in the near future? My big concern is a world that is divided completely in two. Citizens of rich countries where vaccines are freely and easily accessible, the world opens up to them. They can travel anywhere, resume their professional lives, go visit family, even go on vacation. Whereas another part of the world is literally locked up within each citizen within his or her country because there's no vaccines available, therefore no vaccine proof, no passport, no ability to travel. Is that the world we want to see? I mean, obviously the issue of access to vaccines touches first and foremost on life, safety, health, and reopening the economy locally. But from a global perspective, we may face several years and maybe even longer of a world divided in two based on who has access to these vaccine passports. I'm very concerned about this scenario, and I think we should all really think deeply about how to avoid it. Now, from the global level, I want to go to the local level. And once again, I want to focus on the issue of vaccine passports, or locally, we tend to call them certificates, vaccine certificates. Because as we all know, when we start rolling out the vaccine, we're first of all vaccinating priority groups, right? I understand that that's the situation in Lebanon. That is definitely the situation in Canada. We're going by age groups. We're going by priority in terms of risk. Healthcare providers are vaccinated before the rest of us. But the vaccine is not available to everybody right in the beginning. So a lot of bioethical reflection was dedicated to how to prioritize who deserves to get access first. Okay, but we're now seeing a shift in some countries from all the issues around we don't have enough vaccines. So in what order of priority should we vaccinate those who want, to a new issue? We have enough vaccines. How do we vaccinate those who don't want the vaccine, those who hesitate? So it's very prevalent in the US right now, this issue. But I want, as a result, because I think at some point, most countries will face this, I hope. I'm an optimist, and I hope that most countries will end up having enough vaccines for everybody. Everybody will be eligible, any age. And at that point, the issue will become, how do we cope with vaccine resistance or vaccine hesitancy? So I want to offer a few ethical reflections, principles, and some distinctions surrounding this issue of hesitancy and resistance. First of all, if somebody says, yeah, there's a global pandemic, I live in a shutdown, but I do not want to be vaccinated. This obviously raises the tension between individual rights, individual liberties, and public safety, common good. As long as not enough people are vaccinated, we're facing shutdown like I'm facing right now. We're obviously facing travel restrictions, the economy suffers. So the common good is obviously to get to a high rate of vaccination, and the tension is with individual liberties. in the case of the pandemic, as opposed to other vaccines, we saw measles outbreaks because of vaccine hesitancy and anti-vax before COVID. But that was just a health issue. Now, beyond the health and the safety, we're also talking about the economy, right? The economy around the world has suffered profoundly. Without high rates of vaccine, we cannot open up the economy. So the common good at this point is not just health, it's also economical. So if the issue is individual rights versus the common good, the question becomes, what measures are ethically acceptable to push forward vaccination rates? There are many suggested measures, and they currently go from the more coercive approaches to the more incentivizing approaches. Questions such as, should we force people to be vaccinated? What does forcing mean? We're not going to be holding people down and vaccinating them by force. So what does it mean if we say we should force them? Should we punish people who refuse to be vaccinated? How? If we have this notion of punishing, how? Should we give people significant incentives to vaccinate? Should we pay them to get the vaccines? Some countries are already doing that. Should we encourage them? Should you make it particularly easy to get the vaccine? Obviously, the vaccine is offered for free. People are not paying for it, but should we offer it like in New York, in the subway, in churches, in certain countries, in mosques or synagogues? Should the government pay for your travel to go to the vaccination site? Should you get paid time off work to get vaccinated? So many, many measures have been suggested for encouraging vaccination rates. I want to take a step back before diving into these different measures and talk about some public health ethics principles that give us some guidance. And there are at least 3 public health ethics principles that are relevant here. The first is proportionality. We're told that public health benefits should outweigh the infringement of other moral considerations. So if we're going to make it very difficult for people not to get the vaccine to the point that we're infringing on their individual liberties, there should be a public health benefit that justifies that. I think in the case of the COVID vaccine, the interventions are proportional. There's the principle of necessity. When we look at a proposed solution to a public health problem, we have to also look for all the alternative strategies that are less morally troubling and only move ahead with a solution if it's the least morally troubling that we have. Is it necessary to force people to be vaccinated? That's the big question here. And the last public health ethics principle that's relevant is the least infringement principle, which says that public health agents should seek to minimize the infringement of general moral considerations, such as autonomy, liberty, and privacy. So maybe it's okay to encourage people, but it's not okay to force them. You see that proportionality, necessity, and least infringement, these 3 principles almost tell us the same thing here. They tell us, consider your alternatives, make sure you limit individual liberties and rights in the most minimal way possible, and always look at alternatives. So with these 3 principles in mind, let's look at some key distinctions and then let's discuss together. The first distinction is between people who are hardcore anti-vaccine, were maybe anti-vaccine before COVID, did not want to vaccinate their kids against measles, vaccines that are, or polio, vaccines that have been around for decades and are known to be safe. So anti-vax versus what we now call COVID hesitants. So some people are pro-vaccines, but they want to wait before they get the COVID vaccine because they have concerns. Why do they have concerns? Well, it's a new vaccine. We don't have years or decades of experience with its side effects or long-term effects. It was developed very fast. Some people are suspicious that because it was so rapid. Maybe scientific corners were cut. We, the experts, the scientists, know that that is not true. Corners were not cut. It was rapid because administrative corners were cut, and it was more efficient. But some people have concerns about how fast the development was. And some people have legitimate concerns about the political and economic pressures surrounding vaccine development. So obviously, pharmaceutical companies knew that whoever the winner is, whoever gets to the holy grail of the vaccine is going to make billions of dollars. And indeed, since they have made billions of dollars. And people are aware of the political pressure to develop a vaccine because governments wanted to show their citizens that they're doing everything they can to get them out of shutdown and to get the economy open. So under such political and economic pressure, people are concerned that maybe the vaccine is not as safe as we are told. And finally, people have different levels of risk tolerance or comfort with uncertainty. So different people view the vaccine, the COVID vaccine differently. Anti-vax in general is a problem we've had for years, right? We've developed many strategies to try and deal with it. They're not very successful. COVID hesitancy is a different matter because by communicating the scientific facts to people, we can reduce their hesitancy, their discomfort, and convince them that the vaccines are safe and that it's definitely safer to be vaccinated than to actually get sick. The second distinction is between legitimate concerns regarding the vaccine that I just described and conspiracy theories. You're seeing all over social media, people telling you that the vaccine implants a chip in your arm because the government wants to track you down. People made up stories of all kinds. And these stories, because of the power of social media, are circulating. It's sad, it's tragic because anyone refusing a vaccine because of a conspiracy theory or misinformation, it could cost them their life. They could actually become sick and die because of misinformation. So this is not, it's not funny. It's actually tragic. I mean, some of those theories are funny, but it's tragic to what degree some people buy this and actually refuse the vaccine based on that. How to fight this on social media. My colleagues, some of our colleagues are doing research on what are the most effective ways to discredit these theories and to fight misinformation, especially on social media. So there's already evidence-informed strategies for this. Anyone who is operating on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, I invite everybody to take part in this effort to fight misinformation. The third distinction I want to put on the table is between incentives and coercion. So what is coercion in the context of vaccine? You can tell people that if they're not vaccinated, they're going to lose their jobs because they won't be allowed back in the hospital, back in offices. You can tell people that they will have to pay a penalty if they're not vaccinated. You can limit their movement. Vaccine certificates, in a way, are a coercive measure because they say we're going to open up society to those who are vaccinated. Those who aren't will remain more limited. So it's maybe a very minor coercion or very minor burden, but it's still on the coercive side. What are incentives? Well, some US hospitals are currently paying their employees $500 to get vaccinated. The idea of rewarding people for the vaccine in various ways is circulating around. Not all governments or not all employers have that kind of resource. But the notion of incentives versus coercion is very interesting, as it's an ongoing debate in bioethics right now. I want to ask what increases public trust, key issue. And when I look overall, I think that incentives obviously increase trust more than coercive approaches. We're human beings. When somebody forces us to do something, we become suspicious. We suspect that it's not good for us. If it's good for us, why are we being forced to do it? So between the carrot and the stick, I think that the carrot is more aligned with public trust, with building and increasing public trust. But in some countries, we may get to the point that we need the stick because the carrots are not working. And finally, those famous vaccine certificates or passports or green badges. A lot of countries have different names for them. At the international level, we already talked about how this will limit travel and potentially create two global populations, those who are free to move and those who are locked up in their countries. But at the local level, there's a host of complicated issues. If we have vaccine certificates, how do we use them? Are they necessary only to go into fun places like restaurants, museums, and concerts? Are they necessary to go into a supermarket to get food? Are you going to lose your job if you don't have them? Who protects the information that is included in this vaccine certificate? Is it on paper? Is it electronic on your smartphone? Can it be falsified? Are we going to see a wave of forged certificates? Was this a public health issue? And finally, discrimination. If we believe that people have the right to make their own decisions, is it ethically acceptable to discriminate against those who refuse the vaccine and create basically two populations, one with much more freedom and liberty than the other? So I know I asked more questions than I gave answers, but I just wanted to give sort of a mapping of the various issues that bioethicists are currently discussing around equity and how to promote vaccination globally and locally, nationally. And I just want to open up to questions to make this more interactive and more stimulating for everybody. So Talia, I'm going to stop at this point and we can discuss together. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much for this and for the very important questions that you've raised. I want to start with one question, as I'm sure others have some questions for you as well. Because you mentioned paying people to get the vaccine, regardless of whether it's employees who are paying $500 for people to get the vaccine, or other kinds of jobs. My question is, this is indirect coercion if the person being paid is below the minimum decent level of living. So people who are in the poverty line will find this undue coercion. They will say yes, even if they don't want to, because they need the money for one reason or another. So should there be any side effects to a vaccine, since we still really don't know how this is going to happen? Who is going to pay for this? Who's going to treat them for free? Whose responsibility is this?
Oh, yeah, you're raising critically important questions. Because the scenario that I described in U.S. hospitals, obviously, if you're an employee of a hospital and your employer made this private decision to pay you, you have healthcare insurance, and you will be well supported if you happen to be one of the rare cases that has a side effect. So this is a very, very different scenario than a country. I won't name any country, but any country that does not have universal health care, where some people are not insured, and where some people, as you say, see an amount of money that, for some people it could be, oh, nice to have. For other people, it could be bread on the table, especially at the end of a pandemic when many people lost their jobs, their businesses, etc. So how do you determine the level of the amount that constitutes coercion? And even if it is coercion, some people currently justify coercive measures. And they say, yeah, this may actually be coercive to offer somebody money if they're currently needing this money to support their family's basic needs, but that's okay. The vaccine is safe. We all globally need people to vaccinate, so it's okay to use coercion. So the questions you're asking are very complex, and I think they're going to be around because currently we're still struggling with how to get enough vaccines for everybody. But the production is millions and millions of vaccines a day. Eventually, we will have enough, and these will become the questions. So once again, I'm sorry I don't have answers, but I am very concerned, Talia, as you said, that I don't want to say this is a big social experiment, but to some degree it is, because we're vaccinating the world for the first time. We don't want the poor of the world and the disadvantaged of the world to be the ones carrying all the burden of finding out the long-term effects of the vaccine. We want all of us to carry this burden equally. So the issues you're raising about coercion are very valid and very complex. At the end, every country will have to struggle on its own. Another issue is your employer giving you an incentive, or is your government deciding as a policy level what incentives are given? It can be a tax benefit for everybody, or it can be a little stipend from the government paid to everybody equally or based on your income. There are so many ways to do this. But the ethical aspects of this idea are very complex, and some people are already saying this is not the way to go. You can reward people by making it easy, free, give them time off work, pay them a taxi to go get vaccinated. You can do a lot of things to facilitate, but you shouldn't pay people. These are the questions we'll be struggling with in the next few years. So thank you for the question.
And one of the worst things I think so far is the fact that we give patents, and which means that pharmaceutical companies can charge as much as they want, and we cannot turn a blind eye to politics. For example, many vaccines are acceptable in certain countries if you want to travel to them, but not others, and that's for political reasons, which is going to hinder people from traveling, even if it's related to their work. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to see if my colleagues have any questions for you, Vardit. Because I can ask till morning.
I have a question, if I may.
Please, Stan, go ahead.
You mentioned, maybe this is a detail, but I'm curious. You mentioned kind of in passing that there's a difference between there's a difference between an employer offering an incentive, a monetary incentive, and the state doing so ethically. I'm just curious what you feel how is this ethically different?
Thank you. I was actually going to use the extra time to make a comment about the difference between the public and the private sector for all measures. So you're opening the door for me, so thank you. The issue of who decides what measure to implement and who actually has the authority to implement it, it has huge ethical ramifications, not just for incentives, but also for vaccine certificates. So for example, in some countries, every employer gets to decide if they're going to let their employees come back to the office or go back to work without a vaccine. And that's your privilege as an employer. You're free to fire people who refuse to be vaccinated because it's a private enterprise and it's your decision. In other countries, this would be considered discrimination, and the government will make a decision for everybody what are vaccine certificates and what they can and cannot be used for. For example, the government can decide that you can't enter big entertainment facilities without a vaccine, but you're allowed to go back to work without a vaccine. If the government makes this decision, okay, I will take a position here. I think that on these decisions regarding incentives and limitations in the shape of certificates, government policy is ethically better, superior to private sector decision-making. In direct response to your question, Stas. When the government makes this decision, it's based on, hopefully, not just political pressure, but a lot of ethical reflection about the implications of the decision, consultation with public health experts and bioethicists, as we're seeing in some places. Maybe public consultation to see what the public prefers in terms of measures. And the result is evidence-informed policy that is equitable, applied across the board equally for all similar cases, and that prevents discrimination as much as possible. So back to the public health principles, this would be a policy that violates as little as possible human rights and individual liberties. It would be a policy that discriminates as little as possible, etc. If you leave these decisions to the private sector, you're creating not only sort of a social chaos, but also huge potential for discrimination. An employer that has the capacity to decide on what basis they're demanding vaccines, for whom, what is the punishment for not being vaccinated, that opens the door to sort of other types of discrimination, piggybacking to uninformed decision making. Decisions could be made not even based on proper epidemiological understanding of what it means to be vaccinated or not. What is the risk level? So here I do have a position. I think whether it's the more coercive approaches or the more incentivizing approaches, governments should be the bodies making these decisions and implementing them so that people who feel that they were unfairly discriminated against have recourse. You know, some people medically cannot be vaccinated. The government can ensure that these people have exceptions. If the private sector does this, maybe not, we won't have proper exceptions for those who medically cannot vaccinate. So I am really against private sector rollout of such measures and in strong support of governments. And I hope that covered all the various angles of your questions, Stas.
Thank you. Yeah, it did.
Any other questions?
Oh,
تفضلي طالع.
there's a question in the chat. Could the measures for incentives or penalties also backfire, considering that there is still a lot of instability with the mutants and new waves? Someone is asking.
So could incentivizing measures create a backlash?
Backfire, yeah, considering that there is still a lot of instability with the mutants and the new waves.
The way I understand the science, and I'm not an epidemiologist, the faster we vaccinate the population, the better the chance that we can mitigate the new variants. The variants are spreading amongst people who are not vaccinated, and they could reduce the efficacy of the vaccine, which could lead to a situation where we have to develop new vaccines for these variants, which delays herd immunity globally and puts everybody at new risk. So can it backfire? I don't think so, because again, it's in everybody's, when we talk about variants, and that's the big scare right now, it's in everybody's interest to use the current vaccines as fast as possible. Actually, some people who advocate for coercive approaches do it because of the variants. They say it's not like we have time and we can, it could take a few months, it could take a few years, eventually everybody will be vaccinated. They say we don't have that time because the variants are an immediate threat. And so I don't think that these approaches to speed up the acceptance of vaccination will backfire, because I think they will actually help us in the context of new variants. Thank you for the question.
Anyone else? Okay, perfect. So Natalie's saying thank you, but I wanted to ask another question, Farded. Okay, so the government has debated the fact whether we should make vaccines mandatory or not. Now, let's assume the government is not going to do this, but employees are going to request that people who come to the office be vaccinated. Again, side effects happen, thrombosis or what have you. Will this be considered a work hazard? Because they took the vaccine just because the employer asked them and they're not allowed to go to work without the vaccine. So will the employer actually pay for that or cover that or get a lawsuit for that? Same for teachers and schools.
Fascinating question. So let's deconstruct a little bit.
Yeah.
First of all, this is based on, this would be based on a policy that allows employers to do that, right? Because the government can say, private sector doesn't get to make this decision. So it would have to be supported by the government. Now, I don't know if you're talking about public hospitals and public schools, where again, the government would decide the vaccine is a condition of what. But if the government supports this measure and then employers do it, I think you're right. We're facing, and you're in a country with no universal health care, right? Because if you're in Canada, for example, it doesn't matter what health issue you have, you're covered, you're treated, you don't have, your employer doesn't have to worry about it, you don't have to worry about it. But in countries without universal health care, this is a very significant problem. And the issue becomes, as you said, can this be defined legally or understood as work-related injury? And here's the debate that I'm predicting. Currently, it is very, very clear that the risk of blood clots from COVID, from being sick, is much higher than the risk from the vaccine. So employers could argue, we did not expose our employees to any increased risk because they already had the risk of being infected, and therefore they would have had even more risk of specifically blood clots or potentially other vaccine side effects. And then employees would argue, perhaps, but what happened to me happened because of a vaccine. So I think you're right that this could open sort of a new field of litigation or legal arguments that we will see. Let's look at what happens with other vaccines. Most countries, most, not all, have public programs to compensate the very rare cases in which people suffer vaccine-related injury. So we're telling all parents to give their kids a vaccine against measles. And in extremely rare cases, some kids will have side effects, and the government compensates the family for that side effect because that family had to pay a price for everybody to be safer. And I predict that that's what would happen eventually with the COVID vaccine, that governments will create some structures for compensating the very, very few individuals who suffer vaccine-related side effects or injuries, and that would not fall on private employers. But how this will play out, who knows? We're in new territory, and I hope we will use precedents from previous vaccines, as I just described. But of course, this will vary between countries. If you have universal health care or not, if you have vaccine compensation programs or not, what are the resources that the government has to deal with this? Different countries will come up with different solutions, which opens again the issue of global equity. Some people may end up in countries where they suffer vaccine-related injury and they're on their own, no compensation, no healthcare. Others will be fully supported and compensated. That's a part of the global inequity challenge that we're facing, and which leads me to hope that maybe for COVID, we might even have an international body to compensate so that governments with less resources will not have to dig into their own pockets. And just like we're trying to distribute the vaccine globally, maybe we will have an international body that can take care of this for all countries. So Thank you for the question, because it opens another host of complications and difficulties. I hope we will find together as a planet the most equitable solution to this.
Yes. Stan has a question. Do you want to speak up, Stan?
Sure. It's I guess it's more of a comment. It is only a comment that I'm convinced that vaccine hesitancy will be a major issue in many low to middle income countries, maybe with some exceptions. But I'm not really informed in this. Maybe I'm, just wrong.
So you're guessing this or predicting this, and let me try to guess where this opinion is coming from. We know that in some countries, marginalized communities were used unethically in research. And I use the very terrible word, were used. So anything from the Tuskegee, famous Tuskegee trial in the US to indigenous children in Canada. But we know historically that marginalized, vulnerable groups have been, without informed consent and without respect for their human rights, participants in research that then benefited other people. It could be that your prediction is based on the notion that pharmaceutical companies for years have been conducting clinical trials in low and middle income countries that they could not conduct in high income countries, subjecting those populations to risks, and then the richer populations benefiting from the outcomes of the research. This has been an ongoing ethical issue with global research. Solutions have been proposed, but because a lot of the research is done by the private sector, this has been an ongoing problem. COVID vaccine, once again, was developed by the private sector. Will populations in low middle income countries feel that some resistance to the vaccine because of this history and because of this notion that they have been inequitably treated in the context of this vaccine, regardless of whether that's true? I'm not talking about where those clinical trials were conducted by Pfizer and Moderna and J&J. I'm not giving facts. I'm asking, is it possible that certain countries or certain populations will have the perception that they're carrying more burden in this context and therefore have suspicion and more hesitancy? That is possible. Again, the cure for this is information, science communication, reassuring people that the vaccine is now safe and definitely much safer than getting sick, that notions of responsibility and solidarity should push all of us to be vaccinated. But your prediction, I mean, only time will tell, but I see where you're coming from with these concerns.
Last question, because I want to be respectful of your time, Vardit. Diana, you had a question?
Oh, yes, thank you. I was just wondering, how much of a role would the pharma companies have in deciding what measures might be adopted with regards to maybe the vaccine, having vaccine passports or penalty measures for people? I mean, because it would be in their interest to push for to push for such measures. So I'm just wondering how much of say they have or they might have in this.
You guys have the most fascinating questions. What a great question. As much as I know and as much as is transparently accessible, they can determine the price of the vaccine. They can determine who they're selling and what quantities, but they have absolutely no ability to influence policy decisions about how to encourage, incentivize, or push the vaccine. That's on the face of it. These are the issues around vaccine certificates and passports and incentives are policy decisions, political decisions, public health decisions, whereas the private companies are producing and selling. That's, again, on the face of it. Under the surface, do pharmaceutical companies have political power? Did they historically lobby for and against policies? We all know the answer. Of course they did. And of course they have political power. So you're putting your finger on a fascinating ethical issue of how to ensure, as much as we can, that the policy decisions about incentivizing or using coercive measures, how these policy decisions are completely detached from the economic priorities or interests of private companies. In a perfect world, there would be absolutely no connection between the two. But the problem is, of course, the political power held behind the scenes by big global pharmaceutical companies who already made billions and will make many, many more. So great question, really putting your finger on a very complex and not fully transparent issue, ethical issue.
Yeah, and add to it the fact that sometimes pharmaceuticals have a deal with the physicians, particularly in certain ministries or centers, and they get a percentage or a kickback or a wonderful invitation if they ensure that you know the story. So thank you, Vardish. Lovely talk, discussion. Anything else you'd like to say? Anyone else? So the closing words are for you, Vardit.
Thank you. I started out by saying that the issues range from the global to the local, but for me as a bioethicist, the thread that cuts across all of this is justice, fairness, and equity. Whether it's the global distribution of the vaccine, whether it's priority groups locally, who gets the vaccine first, and whether it's the burden of vaccine certificates or coercive measures, at the end, it's all about equity. We're facing complicated public health decisions, policy decisions, and I hope that we will meet the highest standards of equity and fairness, not just now, but over the coming years, to close gaps globally and locally so that we can all emerge from this pandemic together. And maybe the next talk, we will all be in a room together, and it will be absolutely lovely to meet all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Have a great day. Thank you, everyone, and see you during the next Kawakib webinar, hopefully.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.